monsters are just tiny clay figures moved around one frame at a time by an antisocial shut-in.
Those people are called animators.
Hello everyone, you're listening to Outside the Wall, a parental advisory group for responsible use of CGI. My name is XDeath and I'm joined by Raim and Wallenstein.
Hello.
Hello.
Today we'll be talking about Wes Anderson's Fantastic Mr. Fox, a loose stop-motion based adaptation of the novel of the same name by Roald Dahl. The way we came to this film is that some of us have an interest in Wes Anderson, and some of us have an interest in animation. It's a movie that I've personally been wanting to see for a long time, so it was a natural choice. Wally, why don't you give us your opinion?
So yes, I think I'm probably the veteran of the group in terms of Wes Anderson, even though ironically I only had come across him probably about 4 years ago. But I've seen, this would be my fifth film of his I've seen, and I just love his quirkiness that he has, as well as his particular direction in how he shoots shots and edits scenes, and it just is, for me, it's a breath of fresh air when comparing it to some other more modern films. This is the second animated film of his that I've seen. Even though this is his first animated film, I've seen his most recent one, Isle of Dogs, which is the same kind of stop motion animation, which I also liked. There's definitely, I noticed improvements comparing back to Isle of Dogs, improvements in his animation style. And overall, this probably isn't my favorite Anderson. Though I still enjoyed it, and it's, as I'm sure we'll talk about in this episode, the particularities and the uniqueness of this animation style. So, Raim?
Yeah, so right after Wally, I think I was seen the most Wes Anderson films. This was my fourth Wes Anderson film, but the first one that I had seen of him animated. I haven't seen Isle of Dogs, but I'll be sure to do so in the future. And I love this entry. It was very enjoyable for me. As I mentioned in the past, I like it a lot when in a movie they actually take care of details on not using CGI for a lot of stuff when it could be animated or done through like a puppetry or something like that. And the stop motion this is goes very well with the style of the story that it's been told, and I like a lot of the way it was used in many of the sequences. This is one of my favorite Wes Anderson films so far, and if I had to recommend it, I would say that it's also probably the most family friendly of them, perhaps after Moonrise Kingdom that I had seen. Well, before Moonrise Kingdom, and then this one, and then Moonrise Kingdom, I consider the most family friendly that I've seen of him. I think, well, I don't know how much Isle of Dogs is, but Wally might say that. And I think this is a great film to watch. Able X.
Okay, so yes, this is actually the first film I've seen by Wes Anderson, although between then and this recording, we've also watched The Royal Tenenbaums together. I am probably our veteran of animated movies, though, and I'm also the only one of the three of us who's read the original novel, which I did to prepare for this. So just briefly, the original novel's intended for a pretty young audience. It's not quite The Very Hungry Caterpillar, but not too much older than that. It's a short, like 90-page book. About half of the length of it is illustrations. I read through it like in an hour on the bus. And so this is actually an example of an adaptation that expands upon the original, which is fairly rare for book to film adaptations. It expands both by elongating the plot and, more significantly, elaborating on the characters, giving them flaws and interpersonal issues. I think it does quite a good job of that. Actually, it explores some of the difficulties of day-to-day family life, which is something it does it in a pretty good way. Particularly, I think, with respect to the marriage between Mr. and Mrs. Fox in this, a very flawed relationship. I definitely liked the stop motion animation. I think that's a very painstaking style, so it's nice to see somebody having the dedication to do it. It's almost dead in the West. At this point, it's only these and the Kubo and the Two Strings guys that really do it anymore. Yeah. Something else I liked was the sort of diction that the actors had, sort of a very laid back speaking style. It kind of reminded me of my favorite. It reminded me of 12 Ounce Mouse, which is a like lesser known, very minimalist animated thing that's kind of meant as a stoner show. It sounds like everybody's smoked weed before they started recording their lines. This isn't quite the same. This is like a classier equivalent of that. And yeah, so this is a movie I've been looking forward to for a long time, and overall it didn't disappoint. That's where I'll leave it.
So I guess you had to pick up on the animation style. For those that might be listening, the stop motion style most people, at least here in America, might be familiar with is the old Ralph Bakshi Christmas movies, specifically Rudolph and is it Father Christmas? I'm gonna call myself out here, but so it's very much in that style where it, as Bexta said, it's very painstaking, and I think part of the reason why it isn't done, at least here in the West or Western cinema, is because it's so painstaking and ergo becomes expensive, because it's not like in a live action film where you can just simply take a few scenes and then call it a day. You basically have to set up a whole scene, shoot it, and then if it at any point is wrong or something happens to the set itself, you have to basically redo it all over again, and it causes it to be very expensive and very painstaking. The fact that you probably need a whole team of people just to set up the scene rather than just having the actors and the usual film crew there.
Yeah, so if there's anybody who doesn't know what stop motion entails, you can kind of think of it as if you were trying to create a live action film using only a camera. So you'd have to get the actors to pose exactly as they want for a single frame, take that photograph, and then get them to pose again for the next frame. You do that over and over and over again until you have something that resembles movement. You have to do this because the figures that you're using don't actually have any autonomous movement of their own. So this is, as I just said, a ridiculously painstaking, slow, tedious way to try and make a movie.
And then the other thing, too, is that you have to make sure each of the shots are consistent as well.
Yes.
I noticed a few minor things in some scenes in Fantastic Mr. Fox, of some minor things that were like, whether it's like a small piece of dust or just a small like tumbleweed that suddenly transported like an inch across the set, that I noticed, at least comparing to retroactively Isle of Dogs, that I didn't notice as much in his newest film, which I think just shows how much he improved upon himself since this particular film, which goes to show how much I think he cares about the style of animation.
Yeah, I mentioned before that I like it. I very much appreciate when a director or an actor is that much dedicated to their craft of doing something that it can be very painstaking and consuming, yet doing so to give an excellent presentation. And I had commented that there was I love this cartoon Gravity Falls, and there was an episode where they're watching stop motion movies and they're talking about them, and they meet the creator of these stop motion movies, and they find out that the figures that they were using are actually alive by some kind of black magic, let's say. And he just makes a joking comment that, are you kidding that doing stop motion animation is insane? So he just resorted to doing black magic too, so the figures would be alive to do the movement that he needed for it. So it really goes to show that work like that it's amazing what you can do with it, and when you really dedicate to it.
Yeah, I think I mentioned this last time, but there's also an episode of South Park that deals with the same thing, where the boys try to recreate an old South Park episode using animation, and it goes the same route where they just get tired of it and ship it off to Korea to have them deal with it.
Always outsourcing.
What's interesting, I think, too, is recently, after having watched this film, I had come across a video essay talking about how this particular movie had influenced Wes Anderson in future films, both live action and his other animated film, Isle of Dogs, and how he basically makes films. And I definitely think the only other film pre-Fantastic Mr. Fox I've seen is The Royal Tenenbaums, which we've watched together. But I definitely do notice that in comparing that film and all of his films after this, that there's that same kind of symmetrical set design and scene shots that definitely I notice now are very similar to how the stop animation works. And I think it's very interesting in how the essayist who created that video essay pointed that out, because it's something I didn't really think of it for before, which is interesting because I think that's part of now what is considered the quote unquote Wes Anderson-y style of filmmaking. And I think it just goes to show how much something like this, despite being very outdated and very rare, can have an influence and stand out outside of this actual medium.
Yeah, so that might actually be a benefit of using a style that's this slow-paced and deliberate. When you have to put so much effort into a shot, you're likely to pay extra attention to the composition and things like that.
Something that they had mentioned before is that, well, at least in Fantastic Mr. Fox, and one of the reasons why stop animation may not be as used is that the lip syncing is more difficult in something like this to portray it as well.
Yes. Yeah, and I think this film definitely gets away with it because of using animals or anthropomorphic animals. And I think we had mentioned this briefly before about how it's kind of using not only the excuse to have this anthropomorphism, but even just some of the mannerisms in the characters. Like one scene in particular that I know I had brought up before is the scene where you have Mr. Fox and his agent, played by or voiced by Bill Murray, basically going through their kind of the like when they go like, "You cussing at me? No, I'm not cussing at you," and they kind of make these like growling animal noises. In other instances, I think Exteth you had mentioned where when they eat, or whenever they do eat, they kind of eat in this very animalistic style where they're just scarfing everything down and spitting bits and pieces of stuff out the side of their mouth. That kind of is like a jar from what the anthropomorphism that we see in the movie is doing. I definitely think that might be a very convenient way to solve that whole problem of things like facial animations that you see or that are very hard to project in this style when we're talking specifically about human beings.
Yeah, I had actually made that comment that the fact that they're animals is very helpful to them because you can the mouths don't have to move as same as human mouths, we can say, and I did like that they weren't just despite being anthropomorphic, they did take into account the animal traits, and this is something that's also relevant to the plot towards the end, the last section of the film when they're trapped in the sewers. Mr. Fox comes up and he says, "We're with animals, right? And our names, our Latin names, have specifications about what we especially can do." And he keeps asking, "So, what are you?" "Oh, I'm an opossum, right? I can play and I can do this." And I'm a beaver, so I can do this too. And there even is like I think it was with the Bill Murray character, the beaver. No, sorry. The badger, that there's the comment of that he was a demolition expert. He was like, "What? That wasn't really related to it." But yeah, I got into that. It was
an example of how you can use the fact that they're animals for the humor of the film, and also to sort of add animation quirks, which are both important attributes for an animated movie.
Yeah, and to be even more simplistic, I think it also helps that it's aimed as a family movie, and having anthropomorphic animals definitely helps sell that and tone down what otherwise could be considered a somewhat serious film.
Yeah, it's interesting how this film manages its tone because it does have things like the use of cuss instead of actual swear words that are designed to make it more family friendly. But I don't think that I think this is done in a good way where it doesn't really prevent it from examining more almost difficult subject matter. When the characters almost come off as depressed, for example.
Yeah, well, I guess we can segue this into some of the ways in how the movie portrays the characters differently than the book. Although, Exodus, you're the only one that can really speak on the book, but one particular character or characters that stood out for me was Mr. Fox's son and his relationship both with his father and his kind of semi-adopted cousin that comes to stay with them during the whole events of the film, and kind of how the son is basically trying to grow out of the shadow of his father and be his own person, or fox in this case, but keeps winding up falling short until we get a very climactic moment towards the end where he kind of does have this moment where he finally finds his own true calling, or finds his own person and is able to live with that.
So to comment on how this is done in the book, there's no cousin, there's multiple kids from the Fox, but none of them have distinct personalities, and they don't have any kind of interpersonal issues with the dad at all. So all of this stuff is completely original to the film.
Yeah, we had commented that Ash's arc is very well handled and very satisfying to observe. I think it's something that some of us can some in one way or another perhaps empathize with, living with the shadow under the shadow of perhaps our parents or older siblings, or perhaps worrying that we don't want our younger siblings to live under our shadow. It's something that I personally observe and can understand. So seeing Hatches go from the kid that people are underwhelmed of his performance, and then going into how he has his own abilities and special quirks that he can make the most of in the situations is very, very endearing.
Yeah, so we should probably mention that Ash is what TV Tropes calls the well-done son guy, where as well as feeling like he lives in the shadow of his father, he's also trying to make his dad proud of him. He's continually upset that his dad likes his cousin more, Christopherson, and he's trying to just find some way to prove himself so that he can actually have a better relationship with his dad. And that's a fairly classic character arc that we see in a lot of other movies, of course.
Mm-hmm. I think it melds very well with family-oriented films. I think, and the intention is to go after that kind of younger audience.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, sometimes you'll have the opposite way where the son's like approaching the adolescence, like the teen years, and he's kind of embarrassed of his dad or distant from him, and it's the dad trying to reconnect with the son. In fact, the Royal Tenenbaums kind of has that dynamic, although older characters.
Right.
Indeed. Yeah, it's interesting to compare it to the Royal Tenenbaums, but we'll have to. I'll contain a bit more comments for that. But yeah, it's interesting to see them as the opposite sides of how family can be in that regard. The strange children that are coming back to, or well, that you're trying to approach again, and in this case, the adopted, let's say, children that is actually fits very well in with the family, and well, Mr. Fox himself is very proud of his nephew in this regard, and it's also Ash trying to live up to it. So.
It is a very common theme of some Wes Anderson films now that I'm thinking about it, because you have, as we mentioned, Royal Tenenbaums, Fantastic Mr. Fox, in a way, kind of Moonrise Kingdom kind of has it, although I don't know if either of you could comment on it. Isle of Dogs also has a kind of, sort of same theme, which maybe in a way, I guess, speaks to why, of all of his films I have seen, I tend to like Grand Budapest Hotel above most of them, just because it doesn't follow that kind of arc. It's more of a semi historical kind of autobiography type of story that I think stood out for me just in the fact that it was different from the rest of Anderson's films, and it's just unique in general.
That seems a bit to comment on your favorite preferences, considering that's a bit how it goes with Citizen Kane and Lawrence of Arabia.
I guess that's true, yes.
These retrospections of a character going through the major events of their lives. Well, not just their major events, but mostly through it. So I guess we could say this is one of your tropes.
Possibly, yes.
Yeah, so if we wanted to, we could put our armchair psychologist hats on and speculate that Wes Anderson didn't have the best relationship with his dad.
I don't know if I'd go that far, but
Or maybe he had perhaps he had a good enough one that he can reflect the opposite side in his stories to explore that side. Well, another thing that we had mentioned is that I like a lot of the details that are taken into the animation and the situations, like when Mr. Fox has been stealing the farms and the chickens, and you see the situations where Felicity Fox opens the I think it's not the fridge, the storage that they have, and then you see all the chickens, and he's like, she's asking, where did you get all the chickens? He's, I bought them on a sale. And then the stories that he comes up with of how he got these chickens and how he could get that many of them are very well implemented in the dialogues are very, very catchy in that regard.
yes, it's I think very smartly written, and I think this also plays into what I think most people know when they say like a Wes Anderson type film. So I think the word that most people use to describe his movies, especially his modern ones, is quirky. And I personally can't think of a better way to describe it, because it's just between the dialogue, the writing, some of the awkward hilarity in certain scenes that approaches just the delivery of the lines by the actors. I had commented on this before, but there are just some actors who I see in other films that aren't directed by Wes Anderson that are completely different in how they deliver lines and how they act in their films when compared to when they're in a Wes Anderson film.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the big ones that stand out for me are like Edward Norton. Definitely is a completely different actor when he's in a Wes Anderson film. Even Willem Dafoe, who's another staple of Anderson, just is completely different. I don't know whether it's tied specifically into what I had mentioned earlier about this movie, Fantastic Mr. Fox, and the animation style influencing how he shoots scenes and how particular he has to be, or if it's just what he asks of his actors in the way he wants them delivering their lines. It's just, to me, there's just moments where in any other film by any other director I wouldn't laugh at, but just the way they appear in the scene, in the moment, make me either chuckle or just laugh out loud at some of the hilarity that ensues from from them saying a basic line.
Yeah, what the humor in the Wes Anderson scenes is certainly one that I appreciate from many more movies. It's as you mentioned, quick is probably the best adjective to use in them, and we could say to an extent it's refreshing to see this kind of humor that plays a bit on the absurd and in the way that the shots are framed and the actors say their lines compared to we could say humor in many other films nowadays. It's really, really nice to see.
Yeah, it is refreshing. I think, as an example, the one that sticks out for me in this particular film is going back to Raim, what you were saying about Felicity Fox kind of catching or getting suspicious about where all this food is coming from. When she catches Mr. Fox and his accomplice kind of sneaking in the kitchen at night, she basically just comes up and, in a deadpan voice, says, "If what I think is happening, it better not be." And just the delivery and the way the camera kind of zooms in at that last sentence on Felicity Fox is it's. I can think of no other way to describe it other than being uniquely Wes Anderson.
Indeed, and the taking into account the idiosyncrasies of the quirks of the animals. I very much like the air scenes with the opossum, Kylie, if I remember correctly. Whenever Mr. Fox started narrating his plan, and he would say like, "Well, this is the plan, and we're going to do this step A, B, and C," and then he just starts observing the opossum, and he has like this riddles in his eye, like he's in a trance, and he's like, "Are you listening to me?" And he just stays like dead. So those moments really gave
Yeah,
me
he gives a
joy.
hand motion, basically.
Indeed, yeah. Those moments are very, very nice to see that they take into account the quirks of the characters and the animals. They were most amusing to watch. I think Evil Dex may have some more comments on how animals may have acted in other films that he like or may not have liked.
Yeah, one that's interesting is that we talked about how stop motion limits the amount of expression, and the animal characters are used to cover that. That's an interesting contrast against traditional 2D animation when animal characters are used, because 2D animation tends to be a very expressive art style regardless. Anthropomorphic animals will still have a very wide variety of exaggerated facial expressions and things like that. One example we can actually point to is The Lion King. The original 1994 version of that had, again, these very expressive facial animations of the characters, and when the remake came out last year using CGI, people noted that degree of expression was lost in that form.
It certainly was a movie that didn't need remaking.
I don't think so. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sure that isn't enough to convince Disney.
Yeah. Well,
As long as they see those piles of cash continuing to come in, they're happy, I think.
Yeah, I think it's sad that these kinds of animations are as appreciated nowadays, and all that they try to do is always like remake an existing animated film into a full CG film, or rather than, as I mentioned, I think the style of stop motion goes pretty well with the story being told with Fantastic Mr. Fox.
Mm-hmm.
It's that kind of feeling that it gives to the world is something that I think even a standard animation or CG animation wouldn't have been as memorable for it. Could have been good, but this one is something that I very much enjoyed, and I love Cuba. So as Evil Dex mentioned, only a few films like that, like the guys that do Cuba or the Chicken Run, they're the ones that are mostly keeping this style alive, and Wes Anderson too. Idle Ducks came like 2 years ago, right? 2 years, 2018. Yeah.
As far as I know, those are the only two ones really doing stop motion anymore, and 2D animation in films is pretty much gone in the West as well. Like Disney, for example, I'm disappointed in them because they've completely abandoned it, which is a shame.
Indeed.
Yes, and basically handed off most of their, if not all of their animation specifically to Pixar.
Yeah, well, they have Pixar, and they have their own films that are very Pixar-like, and that's Tangled, Frozen, all those.
Well, I think that I don't know if you have anything else to say about this.
No.
Just I guess to close this, even though it isn't my favorite Anderson film so far, I still do enjoy it. I think it is unique in both the fact that it is a Wes Anderson film and you're getting something that stands out from the crowd. And I think as a family film, it also does very well because it does that nice combination of being kind of a kid-friendly story, yet also having that humor in there that adults will at least enjoy or appreciate. So, if you've never seen a Wes Anderson film before, this might be a good place to start. If you want to, assuming you want to watch a more family-friendly movie, and in general, it's also, as we've been pointing out, a film worth seeing if you're interested in animation specifically and seeing what can be done with a very old yet very still impressive animation style.
Indeed. Yeah. Well, I think we all recommend this film. And thank you very much for listening to us. See you next time.